My name is David New, and I'm the founder and CEO of Tiny Pulse. And also, good day and good evening to those of you who are also joining this webinar from around the world. The title of today's webinar is the CHRO's Guide to Better Annual Surveys, and it's incredibly topical right now. We're going to talk about pre-survey best practices, what to do to get ready for an amazing annual survey. Number two, after you get the results, what do you do afterwards? How do you slice and dice it to make meaning out of it and to enact actionable change? And three, Dr. Holtum is an expert about this, so he's going to share pro tips, best practices, and pitfalls to avoid while doing this. And I always like to start these tiny webinars to share a little bit of inspiration behind the why. We've all been challenged, and it's also hit home at Tiny Pulse with the COVID-19. And many of you folks are planning to run an annual survey just like we do as well. And we know that annual surveys have been much maligned in the popular press, but at the same time, they're still super important. For example, if you had run an annual survey last December or January, you would have missed a lot of COVID-19, you would have missed social justice, fires, a lot of things elections have been going on in 2020. For us, we believe that pulsing along with the annual surveys is where you get the best outcome. It's like going to the gym. If you're pulsing and you have that great normal habit of going, sometimes you need a trainer to say, well, hey, David, maybe you need to work on your core more to get the most out of your time that you're spending at the gym. And that's exactly what we do here at Tiny Pulse, is using an annual survey and complementing that with pulses to see how we're doing on progress and also tackle topical things as they come up throughout the year. So just a bit of housekeeping before I introduce Dr. Holtum. This is broken up into three parts as I had outlined. So please have your Q&A. You could just type that into the chat and you can vote it up. And then I will moderate at the end of each section, and I'll do a bigger Q&A at the very end where we'll roll all the questions together. In addition, we are offering SHRM and HRCI credits, and per their regulations, we're going to be putting that at the chat at the very end of the session. And then we will, of course, be recording and sharing this recording with all of you folks afterwards as well. And then the last two things is we'll have a poll at the beginning of each section to engage with you folks to get your sentiment. And then finally, we'll have a post-session survey. Please fill that out. It helps us continue to raise the bar and provide more value to viewers such as yourself. So Dr. Holtum is the professor and Senior Associate Dean at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. His research on embeddedness and employee attrition is the most cited piece ever. And then on top of that, he consults with leading organizations like Booz Allen Hamilton, Capital One, Citibank, Rolls-Royce, and the US government and military. And then on top of that, he's not just in the ivory tower. Dr. Holtum runs a big university, and he also has to deal with constituents such as his staff and also students as well. So he's also a practitioner of what he preaches. And then just one final note, during Thanksgiving, when I was trying to give gratitude to people and have more brightness, I actually reached out to Dr. Holtum and really just to thank him for what an inspiration he's been to me and how he's made me be more thoughtful about how I conduct my survey so that I can get more value out of them. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Holtum.
Thank you very much. Really pleased to be here. As David mentioned, we'll talk about best practices, analysis and follow-up, and then how to avoid some of the common pitfalls by using pro tips. Now, the rumor of the death of the annual survey is greatly exaggerated. What we know is that more than 3/4 of major US organizations will conduct annual employee surveys, and we'd like to ask you the question, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much real impact does your annual survey have? Now, I guess would be a good time to vote.
And Dr. Holtum, while we are having the results come in, you might want to click on the present mode to to start the presentation. All right, well, as the poll results are coming in, we see the most popular one is number 3. It has positive impacts sometimes at 34%. Oh, it's really awesome to see number 4, very useful for decision making, but follow through is hard, is a close second at 31%. And then 0 impact narrowly edges number 5, our best ideas come from the annual survey. And then number 3 is decent insights, but mostly a formality.
All right, well, thank you for those insights and thoughts. Looks like there's room for improvement. Can you see my slides now?
It looks great.
Super. So as I mentioned, more than 3/4 of American companies are conducting annual surveys. So the number, though it has declined, is not dead yet. Now, what are some of those best survey practices? Well, first, be certain why it is that you're conducting a survey. Do you sincerely value honest feedback? Do you want to hear from your people? Will you do something differently as a result of getting this feedback? If not, you're setting yourself up for some disappointed employees. Do employees need an outlet for sharing candid opinions? Do you have safe channels for them to communicate with you? And is it connected to meaningful outcomes in the organization? For example, some organizations where I have worked and consulted, the manager appraisals are based in part on employee engagement. In another organization where I worked, the top 5 leaders in the organization has a part of their annual performance appraisal and bonus 20% allocated to employee satisfaction. So you'd want to have a credible tool for measuring that. Now, I'm not suggesting that you need to do all of these things, but you need to at least be clear why you're doing the survey, because what you want to get out of it will drive many of the choices of how you design and implement the survey. Next, I think there are at least 3 good reasons to conduct an annual survey. One is to develop a baseline understanding of employee engagement or well-being in your organization. If you're committed to continuous improvement, if you're committed to being better, you want to know what the baseline is, where you're starting from. And then that will enable, over time, an assessment of changes from the baseline. So for example, if you introduce a new program, you'll be able to see, did it make a difference? And so here is an example of how Tiny Pulse results could help you in establishing that baseline to know where you are today so that you can also track your improvement tomorrow. Based on your initial understanding of the concerns employees have, you can develop an action plan to improve specific aspects of the employee engagement. I did this with a nonprofit based in DC, and during our time working together, they systematically saw improvement in 3 areas. Importantly, these were the areas that we identified in the first baseline survey where they wanted to improve, but they didn't take on all 3 in the first year. They said, okay, satisfaction with communication is low. Let's see if we can systematically improve our employee sentiment around communication. And they introduced a newsletter and they introduced a town hall series. And the second year, we were able to see improvement from year 1 to year 2 based on the plans that they implemented. Third, many organizations are keen to understand the relationship between employee engagement and business performance, especially when you're working in a service industry. There is a clear connection between employee satisfaction and customer satisfaction. And if you'd like to quantify that, your annual survey gives you a great place for starting. Next, I highly recommend that once you get your feedback, that you disaggregate that feedback by certain attributes. So for example, you can see here that I've looked at it by gender. So you can see the responses for females and the responses for males. I further color coded that, green for higher and red for lower. And immediately when I look at these results, I see that females are performing, or at least perceive via this annual survey, better performance, embeddedness, attrition, and happiness. As a leader, then I have to ask myself the question, why? And I may need to dig deeper. However, this is an excellent starting point for saying, wow, there are some meaningful differences, and we need to think about what we should do in the future. You can see my next cut is by job level, non-manager, manager, supervisor, lead, director, etc. And I can see where I'm high and low so that I can direct my effort. Here, I've taken out the names of the locations, but we look across the different locations within a multi-unit organization. Interestingly, the colors tend to congregate. Those green ones may be high-performing leaders, and the red ones may signal a leader that's struggling. And then you can also look at age groups or ethnicity or any number of other attributes. Now, as you're crafting your survey, you'll want to think about, what do I want to measure and why do I want to measure it? You may want to look at employee engagement or quality of life issues. You may want to look at employee perspectives on business strategy and direction, or employee perspectives on customer focus and their satisfaction, right? So there are a variety of things that you could ask your employees. You get to make that choice in advance. Next question, how long should the survey be? Well, there I recommend not going above 75 questions. Beta test it with your HR group or a friendly department and see how long it takes. But if it's taking more than 15 or 20 minutes to complete, I'm highly skeptical about your ability to get a strong response rate. All right, so be thoughtful in terms of developing that survey. I apologize that this is a little bit of a Goldilocks kind of issue, but you don't want it to be too long. You don't want it to be too short. You want it to be just right. Surely the pulsing, is a short technology, and you can use that in subsequent surveys. So in sum, if the survey is too long, the response rate will likely be low. Next question, who should we invite to participate in the survey? Should it be all employees, including part-time, seasonal, or should we include all full-time, regular employees? Who is it that should be included in this? Whose voice do we need to hear? Now, as you go to implement the survey, you'll want to think about when. When should I conduct the survey? I would avoid peak holiday seasons. If you're a retailer, you don't want to be having people fill out surveys December 24th. Instead, schedule it during an organization's historically slow periods, and you'll know what those are. I'd also avoid conducting the survey during cycles that could skew the results either positively or negatively. I was working with one organization, and we were surveying twice a year, and we found systematically the January surveys were about, let's say 10% higher on average than the July surveys. We decided that we would move the cycle back to April and October, and that January effect went away. Interesting. I attribute it mostly to the fact that they had just received their bonus and raise information, so people were riding a little bit of a high. So be thoughtful about when you conduct the survey. You'll want to know, when will the results be communicated and how will you share them with the people? Will that be in a newsletter? Will that be in a town hall where people can ask follow-up questions? And importantly, who will be held accountable for implementing change driven by the survey results? When you ask for feedback, there's an expectation that you will do something with that feedback. Well, when you're talking about the survey with employees, give advance notice so that they can set their expectations and be thinking about, how do I want to respond? Assure them that the reports will be given in aggregate form only and will be kept absolutely confidential. No single individual will be singled out or pulled aside or punished for any response. You want their honest feedback. Now, some employees today may question the confidentiality of online surveys and the ability to track IP addresses, etc. That's part of why it might be helpful to have a third-party vendor conduct the survey. That'll usually reduce employee fears of being identified by this. Well, I'm ready for questions. The harder they are, the more I like them.
All right, so looking at the list, so we have one from Sarah Bibb. Thank you, Sarah. For a smaller business who has around 18 employees and who has never surveyed our employees before, where should we start? A big survey or more of a smaller one?
Wow. Sarah, thanks for this question. 18 people, you can almost get around a big table and everybody have individualized feedback. So there, I think, so one product that Tiny Pulse has is called Peak. And Peak in 35 questions gives you a very nice baseline across a range of topics. That to me probably strikes a nice middle ground for you in the sense that you can get a baseline from which you can measure improvement in the future. Particularly being 18, my guess is you want to grow over time. And so you have the advantage of having this baseline to which you could later add additional questions, whether those are custom questions for your organization or other of the scales that Tiny Pulse has in its library. Thanks for the question. Love it.
Great. I think we have time for a couple more and then we'll go to the next section, but please feel free to keep putting questions in there because at the very end, we'll have more time. So let's see. Someone just had a really good one here. Hold on, let me see where you go. Okay, Erica Joyner, for a newer company, when do you recommend starting an annual survey? It sounds like they haven't identified a rhythm to repeat. So for some, it looks like a blank slate. What would you recommend, Dr. Holtum?
Yeah, super question. So if we think about avoiding, business peaks, a lot of companies are really stressed near the end of the year. Even if it isn't a big service or production period for them, you have a lot of budgeting, planning, and other activities taking place kind of November, December, maybe even to January. So then I sort of think of that sweet spot between maybe February and May, where things may be relatively stable, not too overwhelming. And so that might be a good period, relatively early in the year, but not super taxed from other activities. Some organizations like to do full surveys twice a year. My recommendation would be to do it once a year and then complement it with the pulsing. So that way you can drill into smaller issues or things that pop up, but maintain that rhythm. I'd encourage you, once you pick a time and it's working well, say February or March, then try to stay with that so you can avoid any seasonal effects that could bias your results.
Great, great. All right, so the last question for this section comes from John. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name, Saward. My organization has carried out surveys badly in the past, so staff have lost faith in the process. How do I galvanize them to respond to the survey and then engage with subsequent discussions?
Wow, super question. First, own the prior failure. I would articulate, 3 reasons. I would say, you know what? We did not do a good job with this in the previous iterations for the following 3 reasons. 1, 2, 3. We're sorry. We apologize. We genuinely value your candid feedback because we want to be better. In order to overcome those earlier 3 concerns, we're doing the following 3 things. We're working with an independent third party. We will only present results that are aggregate. No small groups or individuals will be outed. And we commit to you to providing results within a month, as well as engaging you in the action plan to follow up on the items you tell us are most important.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Holtum. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A, so please keep dropping questions in there and voting them up and down, but we'll go to the next section is after you get the results, what are some best practices?
Awesome. And if I'm not mistaken, we have a fun poll. How would your employees characterize what your organization does after receiving results of the annual survey? Let's hear what you've got to say.
All right. It looks like it's also in the middle. The highest, most voted one is number 3 with 36%. Good intentions, but no pulse check-ins throughout the year. Number 2 is very close between great. They share, follow up, and measure progress throughout the year. Thumbs up for that those organizations. And number 2, not much. Seems like just going through the motions. And thankfully, the smallest one at 19% is what annual survey.
Very interesting results. So it sounds like most of you are doing relatively well, but maybe can do better. Let me think now with you about post-survey analysis. So there's some simple early choices about the format in which you wish to display the results. Will it be graphical? Will it be means, median, mode, standard deviation? Sometimes people get nervous when they see standard deviation. They have flashbacks to college and their intro stats and beads of sweat start running down their face. So you'll know your audience best. How do they best consume data? How can you make it meaningful for them? Also, as I suggested earlier with the example, you can disaggregate by gender, by kids, no kids, tenure, age, department, high performers versus low performers. And let me pause for just a minute. As David mentioned, I'm the Senior Associate Dean of the Business School, and in that role, I have about 150 employees. At the start of the pandemic, I worked with Tiny Pulse. I'm also a client, and we used the platform to ask questions about a variety of things that we were doing in our COVID-19 response. I was also interested to know how were people exercising, sleeping, and eating during the pandemic. How were they doing physically? Interestingly, sleep was on average about 7.5 hours. And I thought, wow, that's fantastic. Recommendations are that we get between 7 and 8 hours of sleep for adults. 7.5 seems like we are just nailing it. But then sort of the researcher in me pushed a little harder and I said, I wonder if I cut this by kids, no kids, if it's different, because those with children in the home would be attending to school, cleaning the house, dishes, food preparation, all of these other responsibilities. And it turns out that there was a huge difference between those with kids and without kids, looking something more like 6 to 6.5 hours of sleep for those with kids, and more like 8 to 8.5 for those without kids. And so that says something to me as a leader. You need to be sensitive to the extra load that's on your employees who have kids at home currently. Now, you don't want to discriminate against people who don't have children, but you do want to be mindful of the things that you can do to accommodate those with. So that's an example for me of the reason why you would want to disaggregate the results in a variety of ways to see if you can pick up on different patterns for different types of employees. A second insight here is at the bottom, looking at high performers versus low performers. If my low performers tell me that I'm doing a very poor job with supervision, but my high performers tell me that my supervisors are world class, I'm a little less worried, because the low performers may be subject to personal improvement plans or performance improvement plans. They may be getting feedback that they don't like from their boss. So I'm sort of a little less concerned. But if those results are reversed and my high performers say, wow, the supervisor I have is really not good, then I have a very big concern, and I'd want to intervene to see if I couldn't improve that. So those are two examples of benefits of disaggregated results. And typically these surveys are administered by HR departments or human capital departments, and they can use this data to coach leaders to see the results as an opportunity to gain insights and for improvement. Here is one example of a graph that we developed to try to understand attrition risk versus embeddedness. David mentioned generously before that it's one of the most cited research pieces in all of the turnover literature. And what we see there are three things. One, you've got the quadrant in the lower left. These are people who are likely to leave based on their intention to leave. That's information you get from an annual survey. On the right and in the bottom are people who are sort of embedded in the organization, but not particularly happy about being there. They feel stuck. In contrast, in the upper right, we have people who are embedded in the organization. They have lots of connections. They fit with the organization. They're happy to be. And you see the sentiment analysis. Now, the green, that says they're highly satisfied. This is a really rosy picture to have most of your employees in the upper right-hand quadrant, green. It's telling you the people who are embedded are highly likely to stay and they're very happy. That fourth and final quadrants, the upper left, these are people who are considering leaving, and you can see they're decidedly less dark green. Well, this is sort of a 3D view of attrition risk, embeddedness, and happiness. And this is the value of, again, being able to have a platform that will bring not only the data together, but help create insights for you. Here is a second tool coming out of Tiny Pulse that could be really helpful to you. It's prioritized what you should address first. So the logic of this is, first, you can see the question. Perhaps you can't read it. It might be a bit of an eye chart for you. I feel like I have the opportunity to develop my full potential at this company. That's under the category of growth and development in the PEAK survey. The organizational average on a 5-point scale was 3.71, and the attrition coefficient, meaning how highly correlated is this with people's probability of leaving. Given the high correlation with leaving and the relatively low level at 3.71, we have developed now an indicator. We call this a heat map, telling us where should we focus our attention. And we're going to focus on this top issue. The heat map suggests 0.531 efficacy of doing that, the correlation multiplied by the gap between where you are and a 5 on the measurement scale. In contrast, at the bottom, you see my peers are very supportive. It's at a 4.1, so a higher score, and the correlation with attrition risk is relatively low. So this ranks lower on what we would suggest you work on initially. All right. After you've looked at the results, you need to do some follow-up. And organizations often will establish cross-functional teams to act on the survey findings. The majority of those may be junior or mid-level employees, but I recommend that you have a senior level champion who can help monitor and support the team. And these teams should be in place before you release the results. That signals to employees that leaders are serious about improving. Now, HR should monitor and follow up with these ideas to make sure that progress occurs. I've also seen some organizations set up department-specific teams so that they can respond to particular issues that were germane or relevant to their department. Well, I'm ready for questions.
Great. So I'm going to try to focus this on the section you just talked about, but please keep inputting questions because I'm amassing those questions for the final Q&A at the very end. So Agnes and others have asked a similar question is, how would one disaggregate the results when our employees are taking our survey anonymously?
Wow, it's a great question. Really appreciate your thinking deeply. So there are two ways to address this problem. One is you can ask the questions upon which you'd like to disaggregate. So if you have promised them absolute confidentiality, which is one thing, but also anonymity, which means the organization cannot know who responded, then you would need to ask those questions. So you would just ask gender, ask division, ask whatever variable, kids, no kids, that you want to disaggregate on. If, in contrast, you're willing to promise confidentiality, but you don't promise anonymity, then you can use a marker with Tiny Pulse to merge in now data from your HRIS system, right? Which has the attributes of the employee, including things like when they started or their most recent performance appraisal. And then you can conduct the analysis. In my case, I'll tell you what I did at Georgetown because I was keenly interested in disaggregating. I had a marker that allowed me to match survey responses to my HR information. However, I was not the one who did the match. I had an independent party do the match and we took out the marker. So I had the demographics that I needed, but I never knew the names. And so that allowed us to preserve the anonymity of our employees. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, great question. And when you're choosing a partner, that's fundamental, is to be able to integrate into the HRIS system so you can capture these markers and then you can look at it anonymously in the back end about how that population set is doing. And Maria Alvarez has a great question too, is would you recommend reviewing low performers in that scenario against the aggregate? If low performance with low confidence scores for management are in an underrepresented demographic, wouldn't you want to weight that or flag that somehow to address inclusion concerns? To that point, how do you recommend protecting against confirmation bias and blind spots when reviewing data to avoid glossing over issues?
So I asked for a hard question and I got it. This is a multi-stage question. Let me first disentangle. The question said, what about low performers who are also underrepresented minorities? Let me pull that apart for just a minute to say, one of the examples I provided earlier was looking by ethnicity. And I do think that it's absolutely critical, even more so today than it was last year at this time, to understand how underrepresented minorities are experiencing your organization, where their engagement levels are, where their commitment levels are. Do they feel supported by leaders? So I absolutely endorse that idea. I could not feel more strongly about that. At the same time, I would never make the assumption that minorities would be either high or low performers. That's really an empirical question. And so I would separate the two.
Yeah. Wow.
David, is there a little bit more there? Do you want to push me a little harder on that one?
Unrepresented demographics, just inclusion concerns. How do you recommend protecting against?
Inclusion. Let me run with inclusion for just a minute.
Sure.
I mean, one of the things that you can do is use Tiny Pulse. I'm sorry, I'm sounding like I'm selling. I'm not selling for Tiny Pulse. What I'm telling you is we have in the library questions around inclusion. So we don't need to assume, but we instead can ask and get data we can learn from, we can learn about the perceptions of inclusion. And do people of color, for example, feel more or less included in the organization and important conversations in decision-making, et cetera? So I really love the question. Thanks for allowing me a second bite at that apple.
Yes, great question, Maria. And so we're going to move to the next section, and we'll tee off the poll question. And while we're waiting for the results, I think we can, if you're comfortable, Dr. Holtham, is start going over the pro tips and common pitfalls while we're waiting for the results to spill in.
You bet. And let me just also notice that when I sit in the wrong place under the spire on the clock tower there, I look like a unicorn. All right, I apologize for that. My bad. All right. Well, as we think about pro tips and ways that we can avoid common pitfalls, the first point that I would make is that you only want to focus on 1, 2, or maybe 3 areas for improvement. If you get back a large amount of information from your employees and they say, really, all we want is everything, you can't do everything all at once. And so you'll want to pick and be selective, not only things that are important to employees, but also things that you believe that you can execute on. Second, don't overpromise. Third, consider whether to compensate the leaders based on the employee responses or on improvement from the prior year. If you think that leaders make a difference, and the research suggests that they do, you want to hold them accountable for improving things like satisfaction, commitment, or embeddedness. Let me pause and see if we have the results from the survey.
They are still coming in.
Oh,
I think it's just closed. There we go. So the number one, if you're a CHRO HR leader, what do you use? Number one is pulse surveys at 60%. Number two is annual surveys at 35%. So that's almost the entire pie. No one does employee sentiment analysis, analyzing emails, IMs, texts. And 2 people, only 4%, do any type of behavioral analysis. Examples are giving, receiving recognition to their peers.
Very good. Interesting results. Really happy to explore any questions related to this later. These are sort of the 4 typical ways that companies are thinking about hearing the voice of employees. So happy to pick up on questions if there be any later. In sum, a survey can reveal a great amount of information about employee perceptions that can be used to improve the workplace. The results are quite clear that responsiveness to employee feedback, not just asking for feedback, but responding to that feedback, leads to higher retention, lower absenteeism, improved productivity, better customer service, and higher employee morale. And the simple fact that the organization's conducting a survey can send a positive message to employees that their opinions are valued. Managers can gain insights into the issues affecting their units and thereby manage more effectively. But, and this is my caveat, if the senior management team is not committed to act on what employees are saying, then conducting a survey can falsely raise expectations, which could lead to an employee relations disaster. So that gets back to the very start of my presentation, which was know why you want to do this. And if you want feedback to improve, I think it's a fabulous way to get input into that process. So remember, employee surveys are generally leading indicators of future turnover or low performance. Conversely, if the employee surveys come back wildly positive, you would anticipate lower turnover and higher performance in the future. For me, this is the difference between looking through the windshield, looking forward, versus the rear view mirror. So many of the reports that you receive are rear view mirror reports. In a prior life, I was a CPA licensed in the state of Washington. I practiced in Seattle. And most of the reports that we produced financially were looking in the rear view mirror. They told us what happened in the past. But if as a leadership team, you want to look into the future and say, do I anticipate high or low turnover? Do I anticipate high or low performance? I would look to employee surveys and the pulsing that you can do subsequently as important windshield view, looking forward perspectives on performance. Well, with that, again, I have before you another example of a heat map that can show you where you can prioritize your efforts. Let me pause there, David, to see what questions have come in.
Yeah, so we've got a ton. So this is great that we have the time here for the Q&A. So one that's been voted up a bunch, two that are pretty similar, is Theo Montero says, any recommendations on increasing the response rate? We are 250 plus and had a 62% response rate in the most recent one. So he wants to know tips. And then someone else asked, what is considered a good level of survey participation? So I think it's like, what's a good level of participation? And then, for Theo at 62%, how could he get more juice out of the squeeze, so to speak?
You bet. So I don't want to paint myself as a universal expert on this, but I actually have a paper under review right now at the Journal of Applied Psychology, looking at response rate trends over time. And what we've seen in organizational research is that the average has trended up from the 80s and early 90s to around 50%. Today, we're looking at about 75% response rates as average. So that gives you a little bit of normative feedback. Today in 2020, we're looking at much higher response rates on average in organizational research conducted by university-based researchers. Okay, so I need to tell you that this is, within the context of university-based research. But within that context, the question of what can we do in advance? So best practices include send a notice 2 weeks in advance of the survey saying the annual survey is coming out. It will take approximately 15 or 20 minutes to do. You are permitted to do this on company time. Indeed, we encourage you to take company time to complete the survey. 3, is it confidential or anonymous or both? People like to know. Now, 4, I was working in a unionized environment, working with a company that had union employees, and the union often worked against us. They said, look, we feel like empowering the management with this kind of information works against us in our bargaining. So they discouraged their people from responding. So what we did was offer incentives, and it turns out that their population responded very positively to $100 Amazon gift certificates. So we provided, on a base of 250 employees, we offered 25 $100 gift certificates. So you're saying, Brooks, you paid $2,500 to get these responses. You bet. I think that was money exceptionally well spent. Why? Because we got very high response rate, because people felt like $100 was enough to get their attention. And 2, 25 people winning is a lot of people. That's a lot better than one $2,500 prize that no one thinks that they can win because the odds are too low. So you want to create with incentives the perception that a lot of people are winning, but also manage the overall total expense. So 4 ideas for improving response rates that are proven by research.
Wow, that's great. Thanks so much, Dr. Bolton. And just following up on, in case people have in the back of their mind about incentivization to respond to the annual survey, it seems like some of the research that Daniel Pink has done in his book around Drive is, as long as the incentive is low and there's a randomized component, it doesn't make people incentivize them to do like irregular or bad behavior. Is that what you saw when you reviewed the data as well from that client and in that union example you just shared?
Sure. So when people complete the survey, they don't know who's going to win the incentives or not. And so it should not skew your incentives. I think the follow-up question is, do you think people who respond to incentives are more satisfied with their employment or less satisfied? And to date, there's no research that says that there's a systematic bias towards more or less satisfied people responding to incentives.
Great. Well, thank you for that question, Theo, and from the other attendee. So the highest trending one is, we started evaluating feedback software for our organization in 2021. what do you recommend we look for when comparing providers?
By feedback, you mean employee feedback? I assume that's not customer feedback.
Yeah, I would, whoever responded to this, you feel free to drop something else in the Q&A, but I would imagine, given the context, it's probably about employee engagement feedback.
Yeah, great question. Okay. So in August of this year, 2020, David and I published an article in Harvard Business Review with Amy Edmondson. Amy is one of the top researchers in the world on the topic of psychological safety. And what psychological safety tells us is that when employees feel that their voice matters and it is safe to say the truth, organizational improvement follows. And so one of the top criteria I would have in evaluating a service provider is trying to assess the degree to which they can work with us seamlessly to provide to our employees that confidentiality that they deserve, in fact, that they demand, to enable the psychological safety so that they will share with you their innermost thoughts. I think it's also really important, though, to be able to disaggregate. And so to the degree that your provider allows you to connect your HR information system so that you can do that more refined analysis, I think that would be one of my top criteria. I would also be looking for a provider that allows me, one, to take advantage of research-based questions, survey questions, but also have the flexibility to create my own question. Because sometimes organizations will have idiosyncratic issues or language or concerns, and the ability to create those custom questions, I think, is a real plus. The third for me is be able to add now the pulsing along with that, because as the year sort of goes, employee satisfaction may ebb or flow, and you'd like to be able to follow that. Is it because there was a lawsuit against the organization, employee morale went into the tank? You'd want to know that. And that's what that pulsing technology can do for you. So those are three reasons in my mind, or criteria that I would look at in thinking about an employee feedback provider.
Great, thank you, Dr. Fulton. And then August, Joe, I believe, has a question. When is a good time to change the questions that are asked in an engagement survey? When's a good time to change the questions in the annual engagement survey?
So I'll create a scenario here where we've been using the same survey for 10 years. In fact, I had this with a client, and the CEO was doing an executive program at Georgetown. He pulled me aside at lunch and he said, you know what? I'd really like to improve our employee survey. I said, well, what's the starting place? And he said, well, I was at a bar and me and the COO, we wrote down 5 questions on a napkin. And that was, we've been using that for about 10 years. And I said, well, let's see where you are. And he had questions that were double-barreled, that were actually asking 2 things. And you can't really sort out what people are saying if the question is asking about 2 different topics. So not to be too critical, he's a very successful entrepreneur, great person, great leader, but their survey was trash. So if your survey is trash, I don't know that there's a whole lot I don't know how much of that I would retain. What I suggested to him in this case was, let's use a research validated survey based on standard scales that we know predict important outcomes like employee turnover, employee performance, employee absenteeism, or productivity. And so he agreed, and we implemented a 70 question survey that they've now used for 9 years and has been the basis for them addressing a number of issues over time. One of the things he thought was an issue, but he couldn't really tell from his prior survey, was satisfaction with compensation. After surveying for 3 years with now a validated instrument, seeing salary concerns come up every year, they sought to systematically address it. So, with the support of the board, they did a salary analysis for every position in the organization. And those where they were below the 50th percentile, they improved those salaries over a 2-year period. So, they got everyone in the organization up to the 50th percentile. Now, it's a nonprofit, so they're constrained by resources. And what do you expect? Well, compensation satisfaction followed. Now, it didn't go to 5 on the scale because everyone wants a little more, right? However, they were able to see systematic improvement, and specifically in those areas or departments where they were under market. And so for me, that's a testimony of the importance of, one, using a validated instrument, and two, tracking that performance over time so that you can connect it to important business outcomes.
Yeah, no, that's great. So let me take the liberty of building on August's question. So, you've done this for nine years and 70 questions. What about, let's say we're going into next year and people are thinking about the future of work, especially as, a lot of people are remote right now. And, the promise of going back into the office potentially next year. And, that might be predicated on, are there people comfortable taking a vaccine? And so would it be appropriate to say, like, those 70 questions, you retain 50 core ones, and every year you might ask some free agents or new ones that are topical to the times, such as COVID, which is such a different thing that we've been dealing with as business leaders and HR leaders. So let me turn that back and get your thoughts on that.
Love the question, David, in part because this particular client did exactly that. This past year, they were very concerned about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we developed for them a scale to measure DEI, and it was included in their survey. Because we wanted to keep it at about 70 or 75 questions, we did have to take one scale off. But I viewed that as a smart trade-off. Which scale was giving us sort of the least actionable data? We took that off and we included DEI. So love the question, and I think that there's a great sort of hunger for updating the surveys periodically to reflect the issues of the day, like DEI or COVID.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. We have a question from Erica Joyner. How do you get leaders to buy in to responding / acting upon surveys? And I know this is a very common one. So when you're talking with your clients, how do you cajole, encourage, compensate, or other examples of getting leaders to buy into responding and acting upon surveys?
That's a good question. It's sort of, how do you herd cats sort of question. I appreciate why you're asking because it can be quite difficult. In a different organization where I have done consulting, I mentioned previously that executive compensation is dependent on employee survey responses, and they measure the level and improvement from the prior year. We talk about the importance of being role models. And so in that organization, the CEO agreed that we would report the response rates by level. Okay, that put the executives' feet to the fire. But that's because the CEO was completely committed to getting feedback. And so, if the C-suite or the top 25 people come back and only 10% respond, that is an absolutely abysmal signal about what's important in the organization. So the CEO put a little bit of gas on that fire by asking for me to report response rates by level. Now, no individual was outed in this process. If 2 people didn't do it, I didn't provide that name. I don't believe in witch hunts, but you can hold a collective kind of their feet to the fire, and looking at response rates is one way to do that.
Yeah, well, that's a nice subtle way versus the results, just starting with the response rates against their peer.
Well, let me build on that just for a sec, David, because what we see in the diversity field is that organizations that start reporting their diversity numbers also improve, right? So, I would just use that analogy and I say, if we want to be good at something, we need to be transparent. If we say this is important, we need to measure it. And so I want to give credit to my colleagues in the DEI space who have really done great research here showing that if something's important, you should measure it and you should hold yourself accountable to it.
Great. Very well said. So I have a question from Patrick Robson. Being a music organization, putting on shows all over the world, we struggle with keeping a solid communication stream going outside the immediate manager. Thoughts on how this model can indicate future attrition, especially for any type of remote environment employees?
Yeah, I love the question. My sense, so 100% of my staff right now are not in the office. I have 150 people. And the hardest thing for me is to really have a sense of how they're doing. People put on a good face. It's sort of like the question on Zoom, they look good from the waist up, but, hope everybody's, comfortable. They wearing shorts, they wearing pants, has anybody got fuzzy slippers on? Anyway, the point being sort of you don't know what you can't see sometimes. And so it's really, I think, important to complement the annual survey with something like a pulsing technology, because you can ask questions, how happy are you today? Or, how stressed are you today? How have you slept this week? But you can sort of keep in touch and you can see the ebb and flow of emotion or engagement based on business cycles, world events, or other things that are happening contemporaneously.
And your research on embeddedness is applicable to not only the white collar population set, but also for remote working individuals, such as people in the music industry as well?
Yeah, this is a super question. So, embeddedness has two dimensions, the community dimension and the organizational dimension. In the remote context, community becomes relatively less important. So, I would focus my attention on the organizational component, which is fit with the organization, the values, the job, links to people and projects, and sacrifices that people would have to make if they were to leave your organization, things that would be hard to replicate other places. And so I would focus on that organizational dimension of embeddedness. Great question. Love it.
And then we have an anonymous attendee asking, I believe that you mentioned, particularly in the service industry, there's a relationship between higher employee engagement and higher customer sat. Could you comment with more specifics on where or how you've seen this manifested?
Yeah, okay. So there's research that was published out of two of my colleagues out of Harvard. It's called the customer service chain, right? Service profit chain. And it articulates in great deal these relationships. And so the correlation between employee satisfaction and customer satisfaction is not one. But it is highly correlated, and it operates through mechanisms like more satisfied employees are more likely to stay. If they stay longer, they're likely to develop relationships with customers, and customers feel greater comfort. The customers who feel more loyalty and comfort with the employee service providers are more likely to return. Returning customers are cheaper to service than new customers, and so they're more profitable. Anyway, the point of this service profit chain is to articulate those linkages. And if you just Google Harvard and service profit chain, you're going to come up with 2 or 3 Harvard Business Review articles you could review and then share with your leadership. And I think that would provide the impetus for you to have more support for surveys and then following up after the surveys to help employees be more satisfied and happy at work.
Well, I want to say to the audience is thank you so much. The recording will be coming out after this. And if you could please do us a favor, we're going to also have a survey right after this, a short one, just to see how we did, how we can improve. So thank everyone, and in particular, Dr. Holtum, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you.